Okay, hi, good evening. So we're live on the Lincolnshire Runner Group for the Lincolnshire Runner Show, episode 2. So 2 weeks ago we had Matt Phillips, and this week we're lucky to have Dr. Rich Blagrove talking to us about strength conditioning for running. So I'm one host, I'm Shane from Activation Sports Therapy, sports massage therapist and running coach, and joined with me tonight is Anna. So Anna, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, I'm Anna Mongan from Lindum exercise therapy and similar sports massage therapy and running coach.
So we're going to have Mark Baddeley, who I imagine most of you all know from the running shop. So we're just going to bring Mark in now, and then we'll bring Richard in and ring for a treat, I think. Hi, Mark, you're live.
Hello.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for joining us.
That's okay, no problems.
And thank you as well for introducing us to Richard Blagrove. It was good to have a chat with you back in the waiting room area.
No worries.
Just a minute ago. So thank
That's
you.
okay. No problems. It was nice to catch up with Rich.
Yeah, good.
Okay, so Rich, I was going to say, Mark, did you want to just say how you know Rich and how you made this happen?
Yeah, so I've known Rich for over 20 years. We both trained at Lincoln Wellington together under Rob Lewis. And we trained as middle-long distance athletes. We both actually went to the same school, I'm slightly older, Branston. And and then we actually even worked together at NK Sports Centre. So I've known Rich for a fair bit, and he went off to uni and gone on to great things with strength and conditioning. And so we've kept in contact, and he really kindly said he'd come along and do this with us, which is great.
Brilliant. Okay, so before we bring him on, just to say to people who don't know him, just to introduce him really. So he's himself been involved in competitive middle distance running, as Mark said, alongside Mark as well. He's been involved in coaching international performance athletes and holds prominent positions in the academic field of strength and conditioning, both through lecturing and research. So he's very active in strength and conditioning research. He completed his doctorate with research into strength and conditioning for adolescent middle distance runners. His book, excellent if you can get hold of it, and Strength and Conditioning for Endurance Running, great guide to strength and conditioning. It's grounded in evidence-based research, and it's completely accessible to runners of all levels, so worth picking up a copy if you can. Shall we bring Richard in and have a chat with him?
Hi, Richard.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot for having me.
And we really appreciate you coming on and chatting to this. We've got quite a diverse running group, so beginners through to experienced runners. It's great to have you share some of your strength and conditioning knowledge with them. Did you want to kick off by maybe saying just a few words about yourself, about your history with running and how you've come into the field of strength and conditioning?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the moment, I'm a lecturer in physiology at Loughborough University, where I'm also programme director for a master's in strength and conditioning. I've been working in higher education since 2008. Before I was at Loughborough, I was down at St Mary's University for 8 years as programme lead for an undergraduate course in strength and conditioning science. And then after that, I went to Birmingham City University before then going on to Loughborough. So although I've been working in higher education for 12 years now, I've always very much been a practitioner as well. So I've been working as a strength and conditioning coach since 2006. And I kind of unintentionally specialised in working with middle and long distance runners during my time at St Mary's University. Some of your listeners might know a little bit about sort of the culture of running down in southwest London and around St Mary's. St Mary's used to be the national centre for endurance running in the UK. So they've got the likes of Mo Farah that train there when he's based in the UK, right the way through to sort of first year undergraduate students and recreational runners. So quite quickly after I started working there was a lot of runners that were asking me for advice about strength and conditioning, and I got involved with coaching quite a few of them. Before all of that, as we were talking before we went on air, while I was a teenager, I was a competitive middle distance runner, and I used to run at Lincoln Wellington Athletics Club before I went to university. So that's how I got to know Mark. Used to spend a lot of time in the Lincolnshire runner shop, actually, buying trainers and running kit and picking up entry forms for races and getting bits and pieces of advice off Keith and some of the other staff that worked there at the time. So I've got a lot of fond memories. Of my time in Lincoln growing up as a runner. That's how I got into the sport and got into coaching.
Fantastic, great, really, really interesting and diverse sort of connection with running and strength and conditioning. So thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, well, seeing as Mark has introduced you to us, and he's obviously the coach and runner here that you know, we'll ask Mark to start the conversation, if that's all right, Mark.
Yeah, no problems. Keith will love the fact that you remembered him there.
Yeah, of course.
He'll like that. Okay, so anyway, Rich, I'm love running, and it's a passion. I'm not passionate about strength and conditioning, although I understand the benefits of it. But I do love running. So is there, I sometimes think that hill training, hill sprints or hill efforts can give you a good strength benefit. So, can it be used as maybe as like an alternative, or is it best used sort of side by side with strength and conditioning or plyometrics? What would you sort of advise on that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a common question. I get that you hear a lot of runners say, well, I believe in strength training, but I get my muscular strength from training on steep hills. And I guess, taking a step back for a second, it's important to sort of define what we're trying to develop as runners. And obviously, running's mainly limited by our physiology. So it's limited by the amount of oxygen that we can get into the body to produce energy. It's limited by our economy and our efficiency, and how well that we can clear things like blood lactate and waste products out of our muscles during running. And so all of those sorts of qualities and the adaptations that we need to develop those qualities are obviously best trained through running. And so if you run on hills, compared to level ground running, your foot's in contact with the ground for a slightly longer period of time. So you end up having to produce slightly more force. But that's not quite the same thing as we develop with strength training. So when we talk about strength training, I'm talking about trying to produce really high amounts of force, or produce force very, very quickly. And so I need to use exercises and training activities that set me up in positions and the sort of environment that allow me to produce high levels of force or produce force very quickly. And so that's not what we sort of quite get with hill sprints. And so, I believe we're sort of talking about two slightly different things. That running on hills and performing interval training sessions on hills is really important because it develops some of the qualities that are linked with running. But if we're lifting weights or we're doing plyometric training, which is like jumping, hopping and bounding type exercises, we're developing completely different qualities which still are quite important for runners to develop. And I think the other thing to consider is that if I was to take a runner and say, okay, doing hill training is the best way to get them stronger, I'm actually adding more running to their total weekly volume of running. And so particularly if I've got a well-trained runner that's doing 60, 70, 80, maybe 90 miles a week, and me as a strength and conditioning coach take them to a hill and start getting them to do some hill sprints, I'm kind of adding more running volume on top of already quite a high volume of work. And so that increases the risk of getting injured. And so if I can get them stronger by not getting them to do running, so taking them to a gym and getting them to do some weight training or some plyometrics, for example, that's less likely to cause overuse type injuries. So that would be always my preferred option anyway, I think.
Cool.
Okay, so in essence, there's a place for hill running and strength training sort of side by side rather than using...
Yeah, I think we're talking about sort of two different things. So the hill training for me is you get a little bit of a strength adaptation, it's a sort of specific type of strength, but to really get proper meaningful strength adaptations in the neuromuscular system, you'd have to run up like a really, really steep hill.
Yeah.
You're better off picking activities that actually develop the neuromuscular system. So the things that I was referring to before, so lifting weights and plyometric training, because that overloads those qualities that are related to the neuromuscular system. And so the two different things for me. Like they're trying to achieve two completely different outcomes. One's related to running, and one's related to just trying to train the quality of strength.
Okay. So based on that, the distribution of those type of activities in somebody's training schedule, would you change them dependent upon their event? So like if somebody's doing a 5K park run, or somebody is doing an ultra distance event that has a lot of uphill running in, would you suggest someone tries to get to the point where they can do more volume up a hill? Or would you be like, right, no, we still need to keep you in the gym lifting heavy weights twice a week?
Yeah, I mean, with the technical running training, like I don't usually get very much say over that. It's people like Mark, the technical running coach, that programs like undulating terrain and hilly type runs and interval training sessions up hills and so on. So I usually don't get much say. So if the coach and the runner believe that strength training is going to help them, then I'll usually fit that in around the week. So to answer your question, Shane, like if they're doing a hard hilly run on a Thursday, or some hill sprints, like I'd try and avoid doing any sort of heavy weight training session the following day, for example. I would probably have it either on the Wednesday, so they get at least 24 hours recovery, or position like a heavier strength session earlier in the week. And so they have at least 2 or 3 days to recover before then they're going to do some sort of hilly type training. But as you were kind of alluding to there, as runners become more well trained and they're able to recover from sessions a little bit quicker, like they might be able to cope with doing a strength training session within 24 hours after a hilly run. So with some of the elite athletes that I've worked with, including some that have represented Great Britain at the Olympics, will sometimes position their heavy strength training sessions on the same day as an interval session, which could include some hill sprints. The rationale being that it gets all of the hard work out the way. So whether we're stressing like the metabolic system or the cardiovascular system or the neuromuscular system, we do all the heavy stuff on the same day. So the following day, which might be a Wednesday or a Friday, is just complete recovery. So it might be jogging for 30 minutes to an hour. It might be doing a bit of cross training, but they're able to cope with that sort of volume and intensity of activity all on one day.
Okay. Perfect. I think that's actually just answered. I've just seen this question pop up from Aaron Scott, who said, would you advise weights on easy days or on same days as session day, which I think you pretty much just covered there. So that was good, timely answer.
Yeah, so someone like Aaron, because he's a pretty high standard runner. Like, if he's got the time in his week to do that, then that would be one option. We'd have to look at a few other factors as well. But that doesn't necessarily apply to every single runner. So, like, I think most of us have got families, we've got social lives. Like we work 9 till 5 or do shifts or something. And so if I was to use the same approach with every single runner, like it just wouldn't work. If I was to say, right, I want you to do your hard interval session, have 3 hours recovery, and then go to the gym and do a heavy weight, so they'd be like, well, that's impossible. Like I haven't got the time in the day to do that. And so you've got to kind of moderate your approach depending upon the constraints that the athlete's got within their lifestyle and what sort of training they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually leads nicely into what I was going to ask about. So, because I work with a lot of sort of beginner runners or runners who are perhaps working towards their first marathon. So it could be working towards first 5K, working towards marathon, sort of beginner and recreation athletes. And the question that kind of comes up a lot is, what type of strength training should they be doing? So bearing in mind that these are some of them are new to exercise completely, so that, and are using the sort of Couch 5K program and are looking to support it perhaps with some strength and conditioning. So what type of training they should be doing, and also if a sort of home workout can, with little to no equipment, can be as effective as actually having to join a gym. Is it actually necessary to join a gym and lift heavy? And then also that ties in with the question that somebody sent to me today, is how many times a week is optimum for strength conditioning for runners. And again, thinking more of the recreation athlete who, like you say, has got that 9-to-5 job and is just starting out, really.
Yeah, I'll try and remember all those questions, Anna, as I'm working through these. So starting off with the types of strength training, like very, very broadly, they fall within 3 main categories. So we've got heavy resistance training, which is your sort of typical go to a gym or a weights room and using barbells, dumbbells, maybe medicine balls and elastic bands to start off with, to move moderate to heavy loads through fairly low repetition ranges. So that would be resistance training. Then we've got more explosive type resistance training, which is using light to moderate loads, but trying to accelerate the load through range of movement as fast as we possibly can. And then I referred to plyometric training before. So that's essentially trying to, I guess it's the most specific to running because the movements like jumping, hopping, bounding, they almost mimic the running action. So they have a really high level of carryover to the sport quite quickly, like even within a few weeks of doing these sorts of activities. But they're essentially trying to train the tendons, especially, to store and return more elastic energy. So elastic energy we know is kind of like a sort of free energy. Like we don't actually use any carbohydrates and fat to sort of propel ourselves forward when we're using tendons. And so if we can train the tendons to act and behave more effectively, then that allows us to become more efficient and economical. So it's a really useful activity to be using. So within those sort of 3 broad categories, like typically, if a runner hasn't done very much strength and conditioning before, I'd start them off with some basic resistance training against body weight initially to start off with, just to focus on developing sound technique and kind of movement competence across just some basic fundamental movements, which then gradually over time they can start adding load to get more benefit and start to sort of stimulate the neuromuscular system. I'd kind of leave out initially explosive resistance training just because if your movement patterns aren't particularly good and your sort of competency on basic movements isn't great, and then suddenly you try and move very, very fast, like it will typically be quite ineffective and you won't sort of optimize the adaptations that you'll get from that. And going back to what I was saying before about plyometrics, because it's such a kind of potent stimulus for runners and it's got this nice carryover, like I typically get runners doing that quite early on, but quite low intensity. So I think most of your listeners will be familiar with like basic skipping drills. So even with a skipping rope to start off with, and then more sort of locomotive skipping drills like an A skip or a high knee skip, like straight leg skips and B skips, and then transitioning forward doing sort of mini pogo jumps and ankling, these sorts of drills. But we're just basically teaching the foot to hit the ground, be quite stiff, so not sort of collapse under our body mass, and then bounce straight back off the surface. Mm-hmm. And then again, quite over a series of months, we can start adding intensity to those exercises by either increasing the height that we're moving with the body or increasing the distance that we're traveling with each little skip or jump or hop or whatever. So hopefully that answers sort of your first question around sort of types of strength training.
Yeah.
And I can't remember what the next one was.
So what else did I say? So, well, actually that also answers the next question, which was related to having to do a workout at home or going to use equipment, which you've covered there anyway. And then the other question which came up today, which somebody sent to me today, was how many times a week would you consider is optimum for strength and conditioning training? So and the way I was kind of thinking about it is a lot of people are coming to us and they've got 5 sessions a week that they can manage to do. So how would you prioritize that running versus strength conditioning balance, really?
Yeah, the easy answer to this is twice a week. Yeah. Purely because if we go to the scientific evidence, so all of the sort of scientific studies that have taken a group of runners, they've split them into half. One group have done their running plus some strength training and the other group have just carried on their normal running. Like most of those types of research investigation, they use 2 or 3 times a week. And there doesn't seem to be very much difference between twice a week versus 3 times a week.
Okay.
And so if your runners have got time in their schedule to add 2 sessions a week of strength and conditioning, then I'll try and encourage them to do that. Again, going back to what we were discussing before, that's often not an option for a lot of runners that have got busy lifestyles and they work and so on. And so another option, which isn't quite as evidence-based, but I've used it quite effectively with a lot of runners in the past, is to, instead of using sort of your 2 sessions a week, you break those 2 sessions up into lots of small units, and then you sort of spread those through the week. So you end up doing something strength and conditioning related nearly every single day. And as long as it's still meaningful and you can fit it in either before or after a running session, then when you kind of add up all of those little units, it would be the same as if you just went to the gym twice a week, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it also gets around the issue a little bit of if you haven't got access to a gym, because you can pick the sorts of activities that you can do around your running, either at home or at an athletics track or at whatever running venue you're training at.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of it is about making it accessible for people, isn't it? And again, if you're doing it at home and you can break it down into those manageable chunks, then perhaps people are more likely to engage with it than not do it at all, because I haven't got 40 minutes that I can put aside to it or whatever. So
and it's always tricky because I'm not trying to sell gym memberships here. I don't work for a gym. But I mean, again, you look at the sort of the scientific literature on this, and the majority of studies use like weights, like resistance training. So they're using barbells and dumbbells and sometimes resistance machines, and you need access to that sort of kit. So most people don't have it at home, so therefore you need to go and join a gym. But going back to what you mentioned before, like there are ways, particularly for beginner runners, that you can overload your neuromuscular system at home. And so if everybody was to do like a bilateral squats on 2 legs, heels on the ground, you squat down, that's fairly easy for most people, particularly if you can move relatively well. And the same if you were to do a glute bridge, like if you were to lay on your back and then pivoting from your shoulders, like hinge through your hips and you drive your hips up towards the ceiling, like that becomes quite easy for people quite quick. But if you're to do both of those exercises on one leg, so you do like a single leg glute bridge or a single leg squat where your bum goes all the way down to your heel, like you need some decent level of strength in order to do that exercise.
Yeah.
And so there's ways that you can find to overload your body at home. But at some point you do hit a plateau and you're kind of looking around to see how you can add some additional load. And the other way is obviously with plyometrics. So I'd be a little bit cautious with how quickly that runners are increasing the volume and intensity with that, just because the impact's so high that it can lead to injury if you're not careful with the prescription. But there's certainly ways that you can go for months, if not years, with home-based strength training for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
so I feel like I've capitalised on Richard's knowledge a little bit there. So I will let
I'm intrigued too. So I think that moves on quite nicely to the topic I was going to ask about, warm-ups, strength conditioning warm-ups for run-specific sessions. And I was just looking at a couple of questions that have popped through on the comments that I'll ask in a second. I think one is very relevant. I know you I think was it last year you published a paper on
Blimey. Getting science.
I read it.
The actual scientific studies.
But I found it interesting because there's a lot of obviously research on the physiology side of it and performance that warm-ups hasn't been proven to increase performance for long distance. But I mean, I've been exposed to structured warm-ups all of my running, let's call it a career. So, can you explain what runners can do and how it might be beneficial to them, both to performance and also would it reduce injury risk, or again is that purely speculative, or has there anything been proven?
Yeah, now, this follows on really nicely from what we just discussed with Anna actually. So we're probably talking about 2 slightly different things here. So the study that you're referring to, Shane, so what we did within that study was took a group of pretty well-trained runners, like they were quite young because they were students at St Mary's University, but all of them were competing at national or international level. Like, there's quite a few Great Britain representatives in the group. So we were lucky with the training standard, and that's something I'll maybe come back to in a minute. But yeah, we took this group of male runners, and they came to the lab on 2 occasions. On one occasion, they did a fairly standard warm-up on the treadmill that they'd usually do before, like a tempo type run. And then they completed a single set of high intensity plyometrics, where they basically stepped off quite a high box and then rebounded off the floor. And so they would have they would have known about it. Like, they would have, the nervous system would have kind of felt that it's sort of activated, and it's had a bit of a shock. And in the other condition, they did, we sort of termed it like a placebo type condition, where they just did a little bit of movement, but it wasn't designed to do anything. It was just designed to try and like mask the effect of the other trial. And they did the 2 conditions in a random order. So some of the runners came in and did the first one that I described with the plyometrics. Other runners came in and did the placebo condition first. But essentially what we found was if you include this set of high intensity jumping before then you go and do like a fast time to exhaustion run at around about VO2 max intensity, that your running economy improves, but your time to exhaustion doesn't. So that might be quite meaningful. We sort of speculated that would probably help like a tempo type effort. And so if any of your listeners are training for like a 10K, half marathon, people will be familiar with this term tempo running. So it's roughly the sort of intensity that you can hold for about a half marathon. And so if you do a tempo run for 30, 40 minutes at a time, and your economy's a little bit better, so it's decreased a little bit, you should be able to sustain a slightly faster speed, or at least get a bit of a second wind in the second half of your tempo and speed up a little bit, perhaps. So we kind of concluded that using that type of approach offers like an acute sort of potentiation effect, and so it might be worth doing. I mean, going back to something that you mentioned, Shane, that like most runners are fairly familiar and sort of locked into their own kind of individual warm-up that they might have adopted over years and years. And so trying to force runners in particular out of something that they're used to doing is, like, in my experience, quite difficult. And so it's something you maybe want to play around with, see if it works for you, try it a few times rather than just once, and try and get used to that type of protocol rather than either dismiss it or try it once and be like, yeah, it didn't really work very well for me. Because it seems to help. And there's a few other studies that have kind of shown similar things, including like a couple in runners and some in cyclists, and one in rowing as well. So it seems to be quite helpful. I guess coming back to the training status, like that, it seemed to work really well with a group of quite high performing athletes. Like, we don't know as well whether it would work for, I guess, more recreational and novice level athletes, because the research hasn't been done. So it may work, it may not. But I guess coming back to the second reason why you might do that, and this is related to what we were discussing with Anna before, that if you've not got very much time to include strength and conditioning in your overall training week, and you decide to sort of split it up, one option might be to do some type of plyometric type training as part of a warm-up. So those exercises that I was mentioning before, like your A skips and your mini pogo jumps, straight leg runs and ankling and these sorts of things, like these are this type of drills that middle distance runners use in particular anyway, particularly if they're warming up for a track session. And so if we can formalize that a little bit and just tighten up a little bit on the sets and reps and recovery, and particularly the quality of work that's going into each of those exercises, then quite quickly it becomes like a little plyometric training unit that you do before you start your training session. And so as long as it's not fatiguing, as long as you've got sort of 5 or 10 minutes after you finish your warm-up, you can kind of chill out, grab a drink, like strip down into the kit that you're going to train in. That's probably enough to like allow your nervous system to recover before then you go and start your running session. And so like I like to think that if you were to do that, say 3 times a week before your hard running sessions, that over a long period of time, like that might offer a reduced risk of getting injured. At the moment, we haven't got the kind of scientific evidence to say that. And so, yeah, with my coach's hat on, like I think that would be a good thing for runners to do. As a scientist, I'd have to say the evidence isn't quite there yet, but the studies just haven't been done. Like it's something I'm actually trying to set up with Parkrun. We're trying to develop a bit of a collaboration with them because we've done some research in the past. But I want to try and develop a protocol where runners are basically doing that, not just for a couple of weeks, but for nearly a whole year. And if we can compare two different groups, some that are doing it, some that aren't, we can compare injury rates between the two groups. Because I don't think you'd see anything after like a month or two. I think it'd take like a year of doing it, and then gradually over time, things like knee injuries and Achilles tendinopathies and so on might start to decrease in the group that are kind of exposing their joints to just more impact as part of a warm-up. But we're talking about like small dosages, so kind of microdosing this type of strength training as part of a warm-up rather than like a 30-minute session or anything like that, which isn't realistic. So hopefully that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah, I think it's answered it really well. Anna and I are actually run directors for a local park run, so if you get that way, then yeah, be sure to mention it to us. We might be able to recruit some people or even lead people on a warm-up for you.
Is that Lincoln Park Run?
It's a fairly new one, Doddington Hall Park Run.
Oh, okay. I've done Lincoln, I think 3 times, but not Donington Hall.
I think we've got some Lincoln Park Run directors watching and some Newark directors watching. So yeah, I think if you need any local park runs to get involved, yeah, Lincolnshire's your place.
Yeah, I'll try and I'll keep you updated on that. It's we obviously need this lockdown period to pass before we start any research like that.
Absolutely. So just going to refer quickly to some questions, if you can answer quickly from the comments.
Yeah, sure.
One from James Sharples. He says he's relatively new to medium long distance running, transitioning from high intensity sports such as football. Any tips to help train the body and adapting to the different styles of movement? The reason I bring that up now is this is a sort of thing I would normally do. Whether I'm right or wrong, I'm not sure, but this is where I start preaching your movement drills, your A skips, your B skips. And I guess with footballers, they often tend to have a bit of a background in movement drills anyway. Open a gate, close a gate, to head the ball, maybe not specific. But yeah, is there anything you could comment on that?
In terms of you mean in terms of just sort of running technique and kind of gait mechanics?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny one, this one. And like I certainly wouldn't confess to being an expert in this area. And a lot of the time, like with the runners that I've worked with over the years, like technical coaches have got quite a strong opinion on it. And so they're either very much down on the side of we need to work on gait and work on developing like a sort of correct running technique, versus other coaches that are kind of like, we need to leave running technique alone, like it's individual. Everybody kind of adapts to their own little idiosyncratic style, and people will become robust within that style. And again, like if you look to the research, the majority of the research says that if you start playing around too much with runners' gait, like it certainly doesn't decrease risk of injury. All it does is kind of shift stresses around a little bit. And so the classic example is, like, you'll hear people say, oh, it's incorrect to land on your heel, or it's incorrect to land like midfoot. You need to land on the front part of your foot. But there's very, very little research, or none at all really, to show that changing your foot strike pattern is effective. Like, it's largely dictated by how fast you're going. So if you take Usain Bolt or any 100-meter sprinter, like, they have to land on the ball of their foot because they're traveling so fast. If you take most recreational runners, that are running marathons for charity or their local 10Ks, half marathons, nearly all of them are heel striking. Like about 90% of them are heel striking. And if you were to try and shift their running style so they were more midfoot or forefoot, like, it just shifts the stress around. So it probably moves it from hip and knee more to around the ankle. And so they just end up getting stress fractures in their feet, Achilles tendinopathies, plantar fasciitis, these sorts of issues. And so for me, with running gait, there's got to be, I'm not saying you wouldn't change it, but there's just got to be a pretty strong rationale. So for example, I've worked with female runners before that have had like chronic knee pain. So they're constantly getting knee pain on the inside of their knee, on the top of their knee. And when you watch them running, they haven't got a good alignment between ankle, knee and hip, like it's collapsing in every time. And they get in a sort of contralateral hip drop, where in the stance phase, their free hip is lower than their stance side hip, which, the other way around. So their free hip should be higher than their stance side hip, and it's dropped. And so they're not really getting enough stability around the hip in order to control the knee position. So in that type of scenario where you've got a female runner who's not able to string together more than a few weeks of training because they keep breaking down with knee pain, like I might look to try and change their gait. But I would probably do that with like various different cues and trying to constrain the environment that they're running in to try and get better knee alignment rather than trying to give them drills. And on top of that, give them some specific strength training for their hip. So to sort of circle right back to the question, sorry, this is supposed to be quick fire, Shane. Circle right back to the question, like for James who asked it, like it would sort of depend what his running looked like. And so it's difficult for me to answer and say, yeah, you need to learn how to run first, because you might be running fine. And so the big thing for me would be, is he getting injured, or is he in pain when he's running? And if he's not injured or in pain, I would say just like go to a good technical coach like Mark and get a good training program. So like make sure that you're nudging volume and intensity up slowly over time, and you don't have these kind of big leaps in the amount of running that you're doing, because that's the main risk factor for getting an injury. So as long as he's not in pain, I wouldn't say he needs to sort of like learn how to run first, because we don't really know what correct running is. There's no such thing really.
I guess I'm mostly in the camp of self-optimization a lot. But obviously injuries happen when load exceeds capacity. So
exactly,
what things you change. And then the other question was from Pedro. He says, how important is it to do single leg work?
Yeah, it's any sort of single leg strength training's part of most training programs that are prescribed to runners. Like the big benefit that you get from single leg training is something called the bilateral deficit, which is essentially a fancy way of saying, if I try and mimic it on the screen, if that's the amount of force that we can produce on two legs, the amount of force we can produce on one leg is there. If we add right leg to left leg, it's like there. And so the difference between the amount of force you can produce on two legs versus the amount of force you can produce on right plus left unilaterally is something called the bilateral deficit. And so per leg, you produce more force when you're on one leg, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so there's a strong argument for doing single leg training. And so you can imagine me working in the strength and conditioning industry with guys that work with rugby teams and ex-powerlifters and so on. Like everybody's about the heavy squats, heavy deadlifts, like Olympic weightlifting. And those exercises are great because we develop a lot of force like centrally from the brain and the central nervous system. But we know that you still develop more force per leg if you're doing things like step-ups and lunges. And so it's kind of a long-winded way of saying that I'd include both bilateral, so two-legged exercises and one-legged exercises as part of most runners' training programs, like a bit of both.
That's a really good answer. I think, okay, so shall we move on to the next topic, next question?
And Mark, were you going to ask another question?
Yes, unfortunately my camera's froze, so I can't actually see anything at the moment.
I thought you were going to.
But I can hear everything, so I can ask away. So yeah, everyone's frozen on my screen, but I'll ask away. So Rich, so there's loads of clubs, Lincoln, Wellington, Newark, as Shane mentioned, and lots of other athletics club, and there's a really high intake of kids, so adolescents, 11 to 16 year olds, and they seem to be really busy and packed. I'm just wondering, I remember when I was younger, strength training and that age group was just a big no-no. He says, you don't do it. I believe nowadays thoughts and opinions have changed a little bit. So I wondered what you thought with your studies and what knowledge to help local coaches, what sort of things they could do, and what your views are on this.
Yeah, so as you're alluding to there, Mark, like we know from the scientific literature that resistance training for children, adolescents is safe and effective as long as it's performed in a supervised environment with a coach that's qualified. So I guess that's the first thing to say. There was the International Olympic Committee released a consensus statement back in, trying to remember what the date was, about 2015. So they're obviously a pretty influential organisation in our sport. Just last week, the American Academy of Pediatrics, who are very influential over in the States, they produced an updated position statement around resistance training for children, heavily advocating its use. And again, there's been numerous different position statements, consensus statements from like paediatric medical organisations, which are all advocating the use of resistance training with children. So it's kind of, that's a long way of saying we know it's safe and effective as long as it's supervised and prescribed appropriately. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we take a group of 10-year-olds that are interested in track and field, and we take them into a gym and we load up the bar and get them all squatting really heavy or picking up really heavy weights. Like the type of resistance training that we need to do with young children, so like pre-pubertal, and then through the pubertal years is quite a lot different potentially to what we'd use with adults. And so, the term they use a lot in the literature is something called integrated neuromuscular training. And it's been quite heavily researched in youth soccer, just because of the injury rates that we see in that sport. But integrated neuromuscular training is kind of like, it's strength and conditioning really, but it's a combination of bodyweight exercises, using light resistance, so medicine balls, elastic bands, maybe some light dumbbells and barbells, some basic agility and change of direction training, which I don't think there's any harm in young runners doing a little bit of that. Balance training and proprioceptive work, so standing on unstable surfaces. And then some specific conditioning, so like trunk and I guess what people would term like core stability type work. Like some specific training for hamstrings and glutes and calf, the types of tissues that are vulnerable to injury in runners longer term. And also some low-level plyometrics and running drills as well. So it's a bit of a sort of mishmash of different activities, but when you include all of those, it becomes quite fun for kids. Like it's not going to the gym and doing 3 sets of 10 on squat and then 3 sets of 10 on leg press. Like it gets a bit, it's firstly boring and it's potentially not that effective long term. So keeping it very varied, making sure it's performed in a sort of safe environment, ideally with somebody that's qualified to coach it, and then gradually over time just building again the load that kids are lifting, the complexity of the movement skills that they're working in, and the total volume of work that they're engaged with. So hopefully the idea being that by the time they get to kind of age 15, 16, when they're sort of post-pubertal, you're dealing with like a young athlete that's robust, like they're skilled with a range of different movements. They're just like athletes. And so they could turn their hand to kind of sprinting or middle distance running or potentially long jump if they wanted and actually perform okay. And it's then not until they reach sort of 17, 18 that they to specialize in a certain event because they're excelling in that event, rather than trying to do anything too specialized too early on.
So just to bring you back a second, with you saying about rather than do anything too specialized too early on. So if they do those exercises, those kind of things that you were talking about, to sort of as an introduction, what kind of age are you thinking there? What kind of age would you be aiming that at?
Typically the recommendations from those organisations that I mentioned before, they describe it as when kids are like emotionally mature enough. And so, like, I've got a 4-year-old little girl, and so she'll come into the garage and lift some weights with me, but she's like, she doesn't follow instructions. She's not old enough yet to do anything that's meaningful other than just have like a little bit of a mess around with some of the kit that's in there.
Yeah.
And so most of the organisations sort of suggest that somewhere between age 6 and 8, that kids can sort of go into an S&C type environment and follow instructions with other children of the same age. And again, it's at that age, it's got to be fun. Like, they've got to be doing some gymnastics and jumping over some objects. So nothing that's too serious. So keeping it varied, keeping it very unstructured, like fairly random in the types of exercises that are being selected each week. So they're just kind of learning skills. So by the time they get to age 11, 12, and they're starting to go through puberty, then you can start to structure it a little bit more. Like, it sort of then feels a bit more like training, but it's still quite varied. And again, by the time they get to age 15, 16, they've then got a bit of experience behind them, and you can actually do something with them in terms of some decent S&C training. But that usually doesn't happen. Like, most people will start S&C when they're adults.
Yeah.
And it's then you're starting from scratch, really.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, brilliant, thank you. I've just noticed a really good question pop up as well. Are you all right for a few more minutes, Richard?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And actually, it's from Chris Burton, who I believe you mentioned.
Oh, not Chris.
A past, not that one. A past training partner, is that right?
Yeah, he's kicked me on most of the last reps of sessions.
So he's asked, how does strength and conditioning training differ depending on distances? So I think this is a really interesting question, considering who we've got in the group, and we've got people who train generally probably middle distance right through to ultra runners. So he said, so like an 800 meter compared to an ultra runner, or a park runner, sprinters to marathon runners, etc. So how are we varying it in those different situations, really?
Yeah, it's a really good question, that. And I wouldn't say massively in my experience. I mean, probably something that we should have started the whole conversation with is, I mean, the main benefit that we get from performing strength training, so resistance training and plyometrics, for runners is an improvement in running economy, which is sort of defined as the amount of energy that we're using to run at a given submaximal running speed. And so there's a huge correlation, like a really strong relationship between somebody's running economy and somebody's marathon running performance. So economy becomes more important the longer the distance. So if somebody's aiming for a marathon, particularly a fairly decent level, like, strength training is potentially incredibly valuable, just because we know economy is such an important determinant, and we can get really big boosts, like big jumps in performance, by doing a meaningful block of strength training in the build up to a marathon. When we drop back down the other end of the scale, so to sort of 1,500 meters, like more anaerobic type factors become important. So factors relating to speed. And so economy is still important down at those distances, but speed is like just as important. So when I say speed, I mean like maximal sprinting speed. And so potentially there's like subtle differences in maybe the type of strength training that I would do. Like with the middle distance guys that I've worked with, they'll probably do a little bit more total volume. So maybe like 3 total strength and conditioning sessions a week. Whereas the marathon runners will typically do 2 if they can fit it into their overall training week. I think the other thing to consider, and like most runners will be able to relate to this, is typically marathon runners and ultra distance runners are doing very high volumes of work compared to the 800 and 1500 guys that are doing maybe slightly more quality and less total volume. And so in that regard, I tend to be a little bit more careful with people that are on very high mileages, just because they're that little bit more susceptible to injury. So particularly if I've got like some of the elite marathon guys that I've worked with are doing 100 plus miles a week. And so if I'm giving them big changes to their strength and conditioning program, like we suddenly whack up the volume of plyometrics that they're doing, like the injury risk goes through the roof. Like the likelihood they're going to develop a niggle around the Achilles tendon is quite high. Whereas if I've got a middle distance runner who's doing like 40 miles a week and their recovery runs are 30 minutes and they're just going out for jogs, like you tend to be able to get away with a little bit more. So a little bit more in terms of the total volume and jumps in training. And I guess the final thing to mention is with speed in middle distance events comes a little bit more stress around like the hamstring muscle group in particular. And so the middle distance guys will do like a slightly more sort of hamstring and glute focused program, whereas the longer distance guys will be a little bit more general and if anything a bit more focused around the calf and the Achilles. So yeah, quite a big emphasis on calf raises and heavy calf presses and so on. So yes, subtle differences, but not enormous.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, thank you.
I think we've got a few more questions. There's a good one come through from Joe, but if it's a long-winded answer, I guess. Which
I'll try to keep it short. Sorry.
He's put, well, this may be a whole different topic whatsoever. He's put, is there a danger in implementing strength conditioning for adolescents with respect to relative energy deficiency in sports, or RED-S, as some people will know it as?
Does he know what my PhD students do?
I think he does.
He's investigating this. Yeah, potentially. I mean, yeah, the whole RED-S thing is really topical. So relative energy deficiency in sport, which has kind of superseded the female athlete triad to some extent and been extended out to males. I guess the first thing to say around that is like for me, both in terms of strength and conditioning coaching and technical running coaches, like I don't think the coach education is great in both industries. So like England Athletics, British Athletics, that are responsible for coach education of technical coaches, and then like the UK Strength and Conditioning Association with me. Like I just don't think coaches really know how to deal with it and know how to spot issues with, or females in particular. And so, I mean, looking back over the years at some of the runners that have probably had RED-S that I've worked with, like you kind of know something's going on and something's not quite right. And it's like, well, we're doing all this strength training, but you're still getting loads of stress fractures all the time. Like, but you don't kind of intervene because you don't feel like you've got the expertise to do so, or you necessarily know people that you can refer them on to. So I think the first thing to say around that is like education needs to be better, because before we even get on to whether S&C is safe, like they need to address their issue of low energy availability. And if that comes with like a psychological disorder, so i.e. it's an eating disorder, then that's becomes much more serious. And so it's that needs to be dealt with in the first instance, rather than just whacking more strength training on top. Sorry, to answer the question, like I think adding like 2 strength and conditioning sessions a week, which might be a total of 2.5 hours of extra time, like that's quite energy costly. And so if an athlete's got RED-S and you're adding that type of training on top, then it's probably going to be, it's not going to save them from getting a stress fracture. It's going to make the risk even higher. I'll just mention really quickly. So I've got a PhD student that's investigating like this very topic actually. And what we're sort of speculating at the moment, that is if an athlete has got RED-S, or they're going through a period of low energy availability that's almost unavoidable. And I never want to sort of advocate that it's fine to be in a state of low energy availability, but we see endurance athletes that are either trying to sort of like make race weight a little bit, so come down a couple of kilograms, or they're on a training camp and they just physically can't get enough food into them if they're running 100+ miles a week. That we kind of speculate at the moment that if you cut S&C right back and you only do high intensity plyometrics, like firstly it hasn't got a very high energy expenditure, so just doing a couple of sets of high intensity plyos, but it might be enough of like an osteogenic stimulus to protect the bone a little bit. And that's what we're sort of wondering at the moment, that does it offer some sort of countermeasure to the deteriorations in bone health that we get with low energy availability. So at the moment, we're just kind of speculating and trying to test the hypothesis experimentally. So I certainly don't want to advocate to your listeners that it's good to have red S or good to be cutting back on calories to try and lose weight or whatever. But sometimes it's kind of unavoidable, particularly with elite athletes.
Okay. Fascinating. It'd be interesting to hear more about that study when it's a little bit more publicly available. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
Do we have time for one more question? Okay, this should be easy to answer for you. It's from Aaron again, who's been a bit needy tonight. So would you periodise strength conditioning, so more in the base phase? Also, would you reduce the strength conditioning in the final build-up to competition?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the best answer for anything around periodisation is it depends on the individual. So it's a bit of a cop-out answer. But yeah, like Aaron's sort of suggesting there that you should be like doing more strength and conditioning during the base phase or like off season, and that's typically what I would do. And so there's more of a priority on it through the winter months, or as we're preparing for track season or a road season or whatever. And then in terms of cutting back during the competitive season, like one thing we know from the literature is that after about 6 weeks we get quite a marked deteriorate or a marked drop off in strength, and that adversely affects economy as well. And so it is really important to keep it going as close to competition as we possibly can. So typically in the track season with like my middle distance guys, on a race week, we'll try and do like one main strength and conditioning session. And then if they've got a week where they haven't got races, they'll go back up to 2 sessions that week. So it'll be a fairly like normal week. And even before sort of major championships, we start dropping the volume down to about 50% of what's normal. But they're still doing like a sort of fairly meaningful high intensity strength session about 3 days before like a major championship. So they try and keep it going right up until the last minute essentially. But certainly volume needs to come down and intensity needs to stay about the same or increase very slightly during the as we get closer towards competition.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. So yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up there. We're about on the hour. So I think everybody watching should find out more about most things that we've covered. But for those who want to find out a bit more about you or follow some of your research, where's the best place for them to find you, Rich?
I guess probably Twitter. Apologies if people aren't on Twitter. But yeah, I'm fairly active on there, and my handle is Rich_Blagrove. So people can find me there. I think where else? That's about it.
Your book, actually, which I mentioned at the beginning, but I think you were off screen at the time. But your book, Strength and Conditioning for Endurance Running, I think that's really sort of an accessible volume for beginners through to elite athletes, really. So that's a good way to find out a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. It's I tried to make it a resource which was as practical as possible. So it's got lots of pictures of people doing exercises and progressions and regressions and tips to try and improve movement and so on. So hopefully it's a useful resource if people are interested.
Yeah.
I think runners, coaches, athletes of any level, therapists, I think that book is probably one of the best resources I think you can have. So I recommend people go and get that, to be honest.
Yeah, thanks, Shane.
So I guess we'll wrap up there. So really appreciate you doing this. I know I've picked up a lot. It's been very resourceful.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. Thank you very much.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us on.
Absolutely brilliant, Rich. Thank you very much.
Okay. So
cheers. Thanks for the invitation, Mark.
That's all right. And apologies. I don't know what happened. My computer just
we lost you for a while.
So I'll come back to that. Yeah. So apologies for that. But I think it's been invaluable what you said. The depth of your knowledge, and I think what we sort of like can take from it and trust it. It's really, really informative. And I think there's a lot of people that are watching tonight. I looked at the numbers, and hopefully they'll take a lot away from this. And I do say exactly the same as what Anna said, is your book, and also, like you say, Twitter. If someone is really keen and motivated on these sort of topics, you know, get looking on the computer and read your book, and yeah, it's really, really useful.
Thanks, appreciate that, Mark.
That's okay.
Brilliant. So yeah, thanks everyone for watching. If you need to find out any more information about me, my business is Active Edge Sports Therapy. Anna?
And yeah, you can find me on Lindum Exercise Therapy.
And Mark, everyone knows you.
I'm guessing the Lincolnshire. I'm the Lincolnshire. There you go.
Okay. So thanks all for watching, and hopefully we'll see you in 2 weeks for the next one.
Brilliant. See you all again soon. Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard.
Cheers.
Bye.